So I thought I would talk a little bit about the journey that my legislation took, and before I start that, tell you a little bit about me. If you look at my background, there'd be a lot of people who would say that I'm probably the last individual who would sponsor legislation relating to agriculture in general. My district in Baltimore County is almost entirely suburban with very little farming. And as was mentioned, my training is as a lawyer, though I like to proudly say I'm a so-called reformed lawyer. I haven't practiced for 25 years, but still that was my professional training, certainly nothing related to agriculture. And aside from being a backyard gardener, I've never done anything remotely agricultural, though I do have two indirect connections. And the first is that my mother raised cattle at her property in North Florida for a couple years. This was many years ago, and it quickly turned out to be an unprofitable venture. So after her first herd, she gave up the enterprise. And then, as Wayne mentioned, I run a nonprofit. When I'm not in legislative session, I run a nonprofit called Civic Works in Baltimore. And we like to say we are sort of a latter-day civilian conservation corps. And there are about 150 programs around the country. You may work with some of them. They engage young adults in meaningful community service projects. And so we operate, by our standards, a large urban farm in a city park using parkland that otherwise would not be used. And we use hoop houses and open field farming on about 3 acres to grow produce that we sell through CSAs, farmers market, and 2 mobile food trucks that take food to senior citizens who can't get out to shop at market, to community centers, and to schools. We're part of the growing urban agriculture movement, which has really taken off in Baltimore, many other cities, with the goal being to provide fresh, healthy food to areas that are considered to be food deserts. So indirectly, I do have some connection to agriculture. And then in my official role as a legislator, 2 years ago, when I became vice chair of the House Environment and Transportation Committee, I also became chair of the subcommittee that oversees agriculture and natural resource issues. So I've come to know and work with a lot of the key players in agriculture in Maryland. Still, my interest in healthy soils came about not directly through my work on the agriculture subcommittee, but through my concern about climate change. I followed this issue closely for about 15 years, and one of my roles as a legislator is to serve on the state's Climate Change Commission. And as Wayne mentioned, several years ago, I wrote a novel called Fire in the Wind that imagines a future set in 2036 in which significant climate change has set in. And one of my major characters is a farmer in Iowa who has lost his farm to drought caused by rising temperatures. And it was very interesting to research agriculture in Iowa and coming up in my mind's eye for this character, the history of this farmer. Now, if you've never heard of my novel, it's understandable. It's sold all of about 500 copies and has hardly become a bestseller. But in any case, my work in healthy soils did come about because of my interest in the potential of sequestration to be one of the major tools to fight climate change. This first kind of popped up on my radar screen a couple years ago when I attended a conference in Annapolis that was hosted by a group called Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. And it opened my eyes to the possibility that healthy soil practices could potentially sequester a huge amount of carbon. Now, at the time, it almost seemed that agriculture sequestration could be sort of that magic bullet to fight climate change that many people have been looking for. What can really help turn the tide against climate change so that we fend off the worst impacts of climate change. And looking back on a couple years ago when I became so excited about the prospect, I realized I was overstating the case a bit. But nonetheless, I know, and we all know, that healthy soils can be one of the tools in our toolbox to fight climate change. So I was pleased to learn last year that sequestration strategies were being considered in Maryland's efforts to reach our climate goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. Again, we sort of model ourselves after California, though our goal is a little bit less ambitious. Our baseline is more recent, 2006. And at the same time, the Maryland Department of Agriculture has set up a task force, a consortium, to look at advancing healthy soil practices and educating Maryland's farmers on them. So there were these good things happening already, but when I read earlier this year of California's passage of a Healthy Soils Bill, I thought that I could give a push to Maryland's efforts by introducing legislation that was modeled after California's law. So my bill was short, not overly prescriptive, which sometimes in the world of legislating is a good way to go. So the bill's stated purpose is to improve the health, yield, and profitability of soil, increase its carbon sequestration capacity, and promote more widespread use of healthy soil practices among farmers in the state. It defines healthy soils as functioning as a biological system, increasing organic matter, improving soil structure and water and nutrient holding capacity, and sequestering carbon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the Maryland Department of Agriculture is to provide incentives such as research, education, technical assistance, and, subject to funding, financial assistance to farmers to implement practices that create healthy soils. So I introduced this bill probably end of January. In Maryland, we're a part-time legislature. We meet for 90 days every year from basically January 10th or April 10th. So introduced the bill at the end of January, and I thought that the bill had at least a 50-50 chance of passing for a couple of reasons. First, in Maryland, farmers already participate in anti-pollution efforts. As you probably know, in Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay is front and center to the state's identity. The bay's environmental character, as well as its role as an engine in the state through tourism, fishing, other means, are dominant issues in the state. And in fact, on my committee, the Environment and Transportation Committee, I'd say half of our, well, maybe a third to 40% of our legislation is bay-related in some respect or another. So strong efforts have been underway for years to reduce the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment runoff that have been contaminating the bay, and we have been making some progress. And farmers have been doing their part in efforts to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. Under the state's Bay Restoration Program, grants are made to farmers to plant cover crops to protect their soil from erosion, to suppress weeds, and reduce runoff. Just last year, over 560,000 acres of farmland in Maryland, representing over 50% of our farmland, used cover crops to protect fields from runoff. This year, the fund will provide $22.5 million for the cover crop program, which I realize is significant and is quite unusual in terms of state support for cover crops around the country. Second reason is that Maryland, as I mentioned, has an aggressive climate goal, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. Our initial goal was reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020, which we're very likely going to attain through increases in renewable portfolio standard, cleaner cars, and also use of market forces, increased use of natural gas to generate power, and decline of coal. But to reduce greenhouse gases by 40%, that's a more difficult reach. And so in preparing its plan to get to that goal, the Maryland Department of the Environment realizes it has to consider all options. And a key reason that Maryland is in the lead among states that are fighting climate change is that Maryland has, in part, has a vested interest. It is the third most vulnerable state to climate change, specifically to rising sea levels. Much of the land in the lower part of the bay is close to sea level. New maps just out this past month show that about 5% of the state's land, about 284,000 acres, will be permanently underwater in 30 years or less, with a sea level rise of just 2 feet. And of course, we all know that sea levels are just going to inevitably rise even further. Most recent projections, at least for our area, are that by the end of the century, around 5 to 6 feet, and that's provided that the rate of ice melt and disintegration of ice in Antarctica doesn't accelerate. So as sea level rise goes up, the amount of land that's permanently lost in Maryland to rising sea levels will go up. In fact, by the end of the century, if not before, the bulk of at least 2 counties and much of Ocean City, which is a large tourist resort, and parts of Annapolis will be underwater for good. A fact that I don't think has hit the radar screens of a lot of representatives from these areas that are affected. So you have these elements that favored passage, but still I did worry that the Farm Bureau and the Department of Agriculture would have concerns about my bill, thinking that the measure, while non-prescriptive, would lead to challenges to traditional farm practices. So when half dozen representatives of both the Farm Bureau and the Ag Department called me up and said they wanted to meet with me to talk about my bill, I thought this is not a good sign. I sort of feared the worst. But I was very pleasantly surprised when they unanimously expressed support for the bill. And my reaction was almost like, really? You really like this bill? And you're going to support this? And not only did they like it, but they would testify strongly in support of it. And so at that point, that's when it dawned on me that the concept of healthy soils was one of those rare win-wins in politics, especially on environmental issues that affect agriculture. As you know, many times these issues where there's the environment and ag, environmental measures that impact ag, they result in clashes and controversies. In Maryland, in the past, there's been some who have not supported our various environmental measures, have referred to it as a war on farmers in Maryland. But not this time. Environmental groups and agriculture would both be supportive. And as we know, healthy soil, and the reason for that is that healthy soils are both good for farmers, helping improve yield and productivity, and they also help sequester carbon with almost no negative trade-offs. Now, my excitement for the bill's prospects did dim a little when some representatives of the organic farming community wanted language stating that the preferred practices did not involve chemicals. And I knew that was a deal breaker for the Farm Bureau and the Ag Department. So my legislative director and I worked out a compromise whereby we listed practices that seemed to be substantive enough for the organic farming community, but left out any reference to fertilizer or pesticides. So the bill provides that the state shall promote practices based on emerging soil science. I think we all felt that was important to put that in, based on soil science, including planting mixed cover crops, adopting no-till or low-till farming practices, and rotational grazing. So with that compromise, the bill sailed through both chambers. It passed the House of Delegates 137 to 1. I never did find out why that one person voted against it. And the state Senate 47 to 0. During the bill's hearing in the Senate, and keep in mind you had lined up folks who hardly ever testify together in support of something. The committee chair referred to the unified support as being a moment of kumbaya. First time anyone said that about one of my bills. But the bill also did not escape the governor's attention either. It was one of the session's environmental and agricultural bills that the governor signed in a special waterfront ceremony in Annapolis, and the legislation got some attention in the local press. So I think the key takeaway from my experience is that there is tremendous potential for support for healthy soils because of the joint support between the agriculture and environmental communities. And as I mentioned, as you all know, that happens so rarely. So I believe there's the potential for healthy soils legislation to take off nationally. In addition to Maryland, we know, of course, about California's law. We heard today of California's plans to support new projects with $7.5 million in state funding. Oklahoma has had a law in the books as well. Hawaii, Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts are all currently considering legislation or are starting pilot projects. Next month, I'll be speaking to a group called the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators at their annual conference, and hopefully that'll generate more interest. And also, in the wake of a conference in France a couple months ago on the sequestration potential of healthy soils, the conference organizer, Betsy Taylor of Breakthrough Strategies and Solutions, plans to organize one or more webinars for representatives, both legislative and non-legislative, of different states interested in developing healthy soil practices in their states. You know, at this point, it looks like state initiatives fall into two categories: technical assistance to help farmers to transition toward healthy soil practices, and financial incentives, for example, government funding where it's possible, as well as engaging market forces to try to support healthy practices. And it looks like, at least at this early stage, that any policy, legislative or administrative, will not involve regulation. I think that regulation of farming practices to encourage carbon sequestration would pretty much be a non-starter, and I think for good reason. One other point I want to mention is that in Maryland, drought has not been a big problem. But in states where drought or other water issues loom large, that could certainly give the healthy soils issue a lot more momentum. And I know one reason why in Massachusetts, the legislation that they're introducing there, which is modeled on the Maryland bill, which of course was modeled on the California bill, has been getting some support because of the drought that they've experienced there. So I would guess that a year from now, there'll be twice as many states considering healthy soil bills, and more beyond then. Given all the important work that the Soil Health Institute is doing on this issue, I strongly encourage you to get involved with the legislative process at the state level. Again, I can't emphasize too much that we need good science, good researchers at the table. Now, as to further initiatives in Maryland, I'm interested in pulling together the group that represented this kumbaya on my bill to discuss how to proceed. My bill set policy goals and listed good practices as examples, but it didn't provide any clear direction on how to proceed with initiatives. So this is what I'm thinking. As we discussed, Maryland already subsidizes cover crops that reduce nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. Can we use that program to give preference to crops that sequester the most carbon? Everything else in terms of their nutrient runoff removal being equal. And also there is, again, this is something that I'm not so sure about anymore, but the fact that farmers feel the need to kill off some cover crops with herbicides, is that something that in some cases I realize may be necessary for farmers, but is there a way to adapt that so that it has less impact on carbon sequestration? I don't know, but that's possibly something to consider. Second idea is it possible to link companies that have a sustainability mission with investment opportunities in sequestration? For example, Patagonia is just one of several companies that's been mentioned, but Patagonia has a very strong sustainability mission. Would it be interested in supporting climate-friendly agricultural practices? Anyone who's been to Maryland knows that our big local utility, Baltimore Gas and Electric, BGE, it supports many nonprofit environmental causes. Would it consider supporting farmers that want to try innovative practices in this space? My next thought is that in Maryland, in addition to cover crops, one of the funds that's used for non-point source pollution control projects to help meet our bay restoration goals, something called the 2010 Trust Fund. Could we get, for example, management-intensive grazing classified as an authorized agricultural best management implementation practice for purposes of receiving subsidy from this 2010 Trust Fund? Now, speaking of money, I should say in my dreams, I envision the state setting aside dedicated funds to promote sequestration, sort of a Maryland-sized version of what's been what California is doing. Given the state's fiscal situation, which I'd sort of place in the middle of what states are facing, not dire straits, we're not hardly flush with money either, but given the state's fiscal realities, a pilot is more realistic, anything more substantial, unlikely. So I'd like to close with some comments stemming from the work of this Maryland Healthy Soil Consortium, which again predated my bill, and now that my bill is passed, is going to sort of take up some of these issues that I discussed. This consortium is comprised of a variety of environmentalists, organic farmers, regular farmers, and educators, as well as the Farm Bureau and members of the Departments of Agriculture and Environment. The members have a wide range of interests in their support for healthy soils. In fact, some of the groups, it's probably safe to say, normally don't speak to each other, such as the Farm Bureau and organic farmers. But in general, they agree on the need to address several issues on healthy soils, which are also among the goals of the Soil Health Institute Action Plan. The first issue is to determine what are best management practices for soil health. BMPs, even in Maryland, will vary from county to county, and even they may vary within counties. Second, the issue of measuring success, and I know, of course, that there is a session, at least one session at this conference focusing on measurement of carbon impact. How do we, well, I guess it's pretty clear how to do baseline testing of the carbon health of soil, but then to evaluate the initial and then long-term impact of BMPs in improving sequestration. Even if there's snow, my feeling is we certainly, especially if we're going to draw private sector investment, we need to have a pretty accurate measure, but I don't want sort of the fact that we may not have the perfect measure to deter us from moving ahead on this important issue. Third, the need to appeal, and this maybe really is the first point, should be the first point, the need to appeal to farmers' concerns. Carbon sequestration, you know, for a lot of farmers, honestly, and not for a good reason, it's not their top priority. They're farming to make a living, which in some cases can be very challenging economically. The economic livelihood of farms is what drives them to change practices. So how do we provide education, technical assistance to identify those situations for those farmers where this makes sense? This can improve the health and productivity of their soils. Obviously economic incentives such as grants are helpful, but in the absence of significant support, how do we do that? So in the end, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to build on the legislative success that we had in Maryland this year. And if we are, it'll be in part because of these varied interests, again, who many times don't sit at the same table, that are working together on healthy soils. And if there is national success, it'll be in good part to the work of the Healthy Soils Institute, for which I thank you very much. Thank you.
Solutions. Thank you for your leadership on this. I appreciate you'd mentioned how you, as several other legislators, are watching what's occurring in California. And I appreciate the nod to Karen Ross and her leadership today from the California model. Now, in California, one of the components that they're also looking at, and she has really tapped into, has actually been emboldening and utilizing ecosystem service credit trading concepts. And I know the Hogan administration has been looking at trading of water quality credits, right. But what's really missing in the mix in Maryland is the ability to trade carbon credits on top of this. So what do you see as the prospects, pro, con? What are the opportunities in Maryland in being able to move forward on carbon trading?
To be honest, I would say they're not great. It would be a while before something like that could happen. And it's for the reason that the Hogan administration's efforts on nutrient trading have foundered, and that's the issue of measurement. There's concern about with respect to the nutrient trading program, how do you get accurate assessments of the reduction in nutrient runoff for someone who's basically selling a credit or who's participating in the marketplace, this nutrient trading program. So similarly for carbon, I would think you would have those same sorts of questions, the importance of measuring what the reduction has been.
I appreciate the measurement quandary. We've got folks that are very committed to working on the measurement quandary, but you also have the NGO challenge, because in Maryland you've got Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been an opponent of a trading solution as opposed to a recognition of being able to do that. And I think that water quality aspect of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's opposition shouldn't transfer into how we'd approach these things from the carbon side.
No, I agree with you, and personally, I certainly would support a nutrient trading program, and I'm just saying I personally like the idea of a carbon trading program. I think there might be some aside from the political resistance to it that might happen, I think the focus would be first on trying to get a nutrient trading program up and running, addressing this measurement issue. And if that type of trading system could happen, then maybe we could transfer to the carbon realm as well. I certainly support it, support the concept, and that's one reason why I like the idea of trying to entice private sector investment and supporting farmer practices, even if there's no market-based incentive for them to do it.
Thank you for being here. I'm from New Jersey, Stephanie Murphy.
Not too far away. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, and you've spent some time in New Jersey.
Yes.
So I'm sure you're aware of some of the similarities between Maryland and New Jersey. in particular, you have the Chesapeake Bay, we have the Barnegat Bay, pollution issues in the Barnegat Bay, and not so long ago, 2010, a soil restoration law was passed that deals mostly with developed areas and the soil quality in those areas. So restoring soils after development. The efforts that you've made are mainly for agricultural, and a lot of what we've talked about today are about agricultural soils. But a few times we've had the issue brought up of developed land and how soil health is also important in those areas. And I wonder if you have any comments or efforts at addressing those areas as well, and because those areas also are very important to water quality, for example. I'm sure you're very familiar with that.
Could I ask a follow-up question? So this is soil health after development, so would this be defined as well as soil remediation of hazardous materials which have leached into the soil through industrial production? Sort of Baltimore's lots of, and I'm sure New Jersey, there's lots of brownfields. In our case, maybe a long time ago, it was agricultural land, but not recently used for ag. So there's certainly a lot of focus on remediation of soil, either in the brownfield context or maybe in between pristine, some situations are in between pristine soil and fully contaminated sites. So is that the context of your question, or?
How much agricultural land is being converted to or developed. And so the conditions of that soil after development in terms of, say, compaction, water relations, organic matter content, and so, how much runoff is occurring from those lands, and therefore the water that's being put into, for example, our rivers and streams and bays, carrying pollutants with it, for example.
Sure. Okay.
And so there's that issue as well.
Yes, the short answer is yes. Okay, thank you. I understand your question better. The answer is yes, not so much from an agricultural soil point of view, more from a sort of stormwater runoff I understand your question, of developed sites. And so there has been a big push. As stormwater runoff has for a number of years been the one area of pollution into the Chesapeake Bay that has been rising. So lots of controversy in Maryland about the stormwater fee, AKA the stormwater tax, which actually we somewhat repealed because of the political hue and cry about it. But because of in the end EPA requirements and now which filter down to MDE state level enforcement, there is a big push to improve the quality and quantity of stormwater runoff from developed sites.
Yes, it's more of a comment than a question, but I just want to say I wish we had at least one legislator like you in every house in the country. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.